This is how my backyard looked only a year ago.
It was nothing more than your standard grass-covered lawn. Riveting.
Instead, I wanted a nature paradise where I could coexist with wildlife only feet from my house. However, that wasn't going to create itself. The first step was to install a large pond that would serve as the hubcap from which everything else originates. I've landscaped and built ponds before, so I thought I knew what to expect. Little did I know I was about to embark on the journey of a lifetime as a full-blown nature documentary unfolded only feet from my house. To get a better understanding of how this all occurred, we gotta go back 7 years. At the time, I was keeping a few goldfish in an aquarium. They're one of my favorite fish, specifically the ones with natural body shapes, the common and comet varieties. They're beautiful, graceful, extremely personable, and make great pets. However, they get large and prefer to live in groups, and thus require a lot of space. Although a giant aquarium or stock tank can work, an outdoor pond is the best option. I always intended to house mine in a pond, but that wouldn't happen until I got my own home in 2018. That's where I painstakingly made my first ever DIY pond. Despite the fact that I had to dig it twice, it was overbuilt and kinda ugly, it functioned flawlessly. Me, the fish, and wildlife enjoyed this feature for 3 years. Here I befriended frogs, toads bred, and the fish who I built the pond for overwintered, thrived, and multiplied for its duration. However, it ran much longer than intended. Not that I thought it would fail, but I wanted to replace it with something larger as early as 2020. Thankfully, various circumstances hindered that from occurring. Allow me to explain. Building my first pond was a lifelong dream come true. What I didn't expect was for it to spark a friendship with the folks at Aquascape who came to my house only weeks later. Needless to say, I ended up with a second pond. All that gave me the pond bug, and I've continued building them ever since. I had a very specific idea in mind for the DIY pond redo that Ed the pond professor was going to help me with. In fact, he came to my house to plan it out, and we intended to build it in 2021. There was an issue though. I was running out of space to run my other channel, Serpa Design. I didn't want to waste time and money to build a new pond if I was going to move, so I scrapped the idea altogether. Fast forward to the summer of 2022 when my wife and I found a home that could permanently accommodate Serpa Design. I glanced at the backyard, and my brain immediately went to a water feature for the fish. Something similar to what Ed and I had discussed earlier. We resumed plans, and things came to a head 11 months later. Ed and Tim from Aquatic Edge arrived to finalize the vision for this design. We also went to a rock yard to handpick the materials. I wanted to use sandstone because of its moisture-wicking properties, which makes it great for growing moss. I love moss. I gotta say, having the opportunity to handpick these was incredible, and I forgot how nice they were until they arrived at my house. Before I get ahead of myself, there was something else I had to do. Originally, I wanted the pond to sit between these decks, but unfortunately they were in rough shape. Although some of it appeared new, the foundation was bad, and most of the boards were warped from not being properly fastened. I reluctantly dismantled the whole thing with the help of my parents, and salvaged what I could. In saying that, I don't see how we could have built the pond if we didn't pull them out.
Hanging out with the dragon here to just try to get a little bit of peace for all of the chaos that's about to ensue. Planning for this has went on for well over a year, but the day has finally come, the day to break ground. I'm excited, nervous, stressed, all these different emotions because there's so many variables at play here, and you never know what's going to happen. Truly, you don't. It's already started raining in this day, and I don't know if it's going to happen as we're building. I'm sure it will because you always get the obligatory water feature rain. I've yet to build one where it didn't. Anyway, all the contractors are going to be here soon and things are being delivered and whatnot, so it's about to be crazy.
And crazy it was. Before I knew it, excavators were rolling up the driveway through the rain. We marked the rough outline of the pond and began digging. It was so satisfying, and from that moment forward, my backyard would never be the same. Even with machinery, manual digging was unavoidable. You just can't do the detail work otherwise, like cleaning the edges, removing loose areas, and ensuring the surfaces are flat. However, this excavation only accounted for the first shelf. There was even more to dig. Typically, I build these by myself using hand tools. Seeing how quickly things happened with machinery and the 5 of us was wild. All that excavation resulted in a lot of dirt that had to be moved somewhere else. Luckily, the hillside needed more height and regrading, so that was easy enough. Things were going well, and just as we finished the initial dig, it rained. We had to take a quick break, and a muddy mess lay in its wake. This area that will become the filter took shape after cleaning the mess, but it was getting late, and the rain picked up again, so we called it quits. The rain continued all night, which meant more cleanup the following morning. The mud made access sketchy for the excavator, so they leveled the berm while Trevor and I set a skimmer. We also picked out rocks and debris to create the best foundation possible. It was finally ready for the geotextile underlayment that would protect the main liner from punctures against the weight of the stones. Next was the EPDM liner itself. It came in a single roll, making installation as easy as it could be. It was very heavy though, so it took all of us to muscle it in place. The boulders are massive, so we added another layer of fabric for good measure, and just as we did that, they arrived. The stones were large and full of character, some were even covered in moss. However, we couldn't add them to the hole yet. First we had to add some components to the intake bay, which is where the water will be drawn into the filter. Next was this block wall. It was a feature I wanted to include to create a more dramatic overhang and to save space that otherwise would be taken by rocks. Once it was tall enough, the stones could enter. I had never set boulders like this prior, so I watched them do it first. It's an exciting process that comes with a unique set of challenges, especially when working with large materials. I was thankful to experience this and learn how it's done. After a little more excavation, the day was complete. We tried to address the overhang on the final day of prep work. This boulder was huge and pushed the limits of the machine. By some miracle we got it over to the hole but couldn't do a test fit because of its size. That's when I came up with the idea to create a template of the stone. However, after determining where it should go, there was no way to move it further and we had to admit defeat. Our time was better spent focusing on others that arrived in the second delivery. There was an even larger boulder than the one we couldn't move, but for whatever reason Ed thought we could.
Yeah, it's 10 feet tall. I'm saying no way. He says yes. We'll see.
I'll admit that we did move it, but not very far. We spent so much time trying to relocate these things that we only had enough time to make a fish cave. I wanted to include plenty of these to give the fish refuge and security if predators ever arrived at the pond. Finally, we filled the basin with gravel and concluded work on the pond for a week. The theme of this pond was rain, and a lot of it. It may appear like the basin was filled with water, but this was an illusion. This was actually displacement from water that ran under the liner. After draining everything, we got a better look at this waterbed bubble. Unfortunately, the intake bay was ruined as well.
Everyone's going to be here soon, so I'm going to get this thing drained down before they arrive so we're not wasting our time. The thing is though, is that as I've been looking at this for the past week, I'm getting kind of concerned with it, honestly. The thing is that once we start adding all these giant boulders in here, it's just going to get so small really quick. Basically the size of this middle area here, which, I mean, what's the point of digging this giant hole if it's going to be so small? So I'm going to talk to them and we'll get that addressed, and we're just going to have to pivot with the design.
I discussed these revisions with Ed and proceeded accordingly. We still had to remove the water bubble, which was quite the process. A rock had to be moved to access the water with a pump. This likely wouldn't have happened if we finished and filled the pond before the rain. So we proceeded to dig a trench and create a sump pit to remove groundwater if needed. And of course the intake bay needed reassembled. The fish cave also had to be fixed. I finished it with more details this time, including an incredible piece of driftwood. Since the stones were giving us so many problems before, we got a larger excavator. The rocks didn't stand a chance. Well, that's what we thought at least. They were still challenging to move, but the foundation was in place. It just had to be shimmed and leveled for stability. We also hid a fish cave under this before leveling off the wall and backfilling the land. The transition into the intake bay had to appear seamless. Luckily, there was a fallen oak tree in my woods that I attempted to age, but to no avail. Tim chopped it into a usable chunk that was precarious to move and had to be fine-tuned for the perfect fit. The space behind this log will be a significant component of how the water is filtered. Most of it will be void space created by those blocks that will be hidden by gravel. This is the same area where the skimmer will be located. We worked out from this area, which included plumbing components. These pipes will send water from the intake bay to be filtered by a bog or returned to the pond's basin for circulation, controlled with ball valves. This installation served as a focal point for an event where Aquascape educates contractors on building ponds. Everything we've done till now was more or less the grunt work to put more emphasis on the technical elements to follow during the event.
So at this point, we basically have 2 days to complete the pond, today and tomorrow. We got all of the stuff down here in the basin more or less addressed. We got a few rocks to put back on this wall near where the waterfall is going to go to stabilize that. And with 40 of us, it should be an easy task to complete, but we'll see how it goes.
I knew there would be many people, but I didn't anticipate the whirlwind that would kick up. There were about 40 people all doing different things at once. Waterfall rocks were set, a trench was created for drainage, the intake bay was detailed, lights were installed at key locations, the skimmer was joined to the liner, and more. All the while it rained, but remember, that was the theme. I'm a man about the details, and one that excited me was this mossy log. I found it while hiking my property and set it aside months earlier. It wasn't alone though. Tim brought a whole truck full of them earlier that we could finally incorporate. I believe these helped make what's essentially a hole filled with rocks look like a proper pond. Before I knew it, the boys pulled a much larger piece of driftwood out of the woods. I guess it was the other end of that tree from before. I did not expect that. The final features we could address before being rained out was some edge work and that section above the block wall. Big Country used my paper technique from before to create guides for cutting flagstone slabs.
If everything goes according to plan, this should be the final day of building. I hope that we don't get rained out because last night we got a ton of it. It was kind of annoying, but I guess in some ways it may have worked out because it kind of rinsed off all of the rock work and everything like that. We'll certainly get more dirt in there, but as you can see, the water down the bottom is pretty dirty. So I'm running the pump right now before everybody comes to get that dirty water out of there, and the water should be here pretty soon.
Spoiler alert, we didn't finish that day, but it was eventful. The crew started working on some of the landscaping while I filled the basin. That dreaded bubble returned, so I had to take this thing on its maiden voyage and direct the groundwater to the sump pit while it filled. While I was getting soaked, others prepped the patio area, ran more tubing, graded the hillside, and began incorporating some plants, including a magnolia tree and a weeping cherry. My yard also had some good finds that would look better by a pond. Meanwhile, the wetland bog could finally be excavated. It was constructed much like the pond, but with a few additional components to transform this area into a proper bog filter. This configuration of pipes creates an upflow system that breaks down sediments to clean the water biologically without chemicals. All of this was joined to the plumbing from the intake bay before being hidden below several feet of rocks. This and the pond's basin would be connected through a series of waterfalls. I had a particular vision for those, so getting the stones just right took a lot of work. The details mattered too. Driftwood and moss immensely helped soften and naturalize the appearance of the edges. Achieving the optimal water flow over the stones was essential, and adding expanding foam and gaps ensured that would occur. This was the final stretch of the installation. Things finally fell into place, and thankfully the rain gave us a break. The respite was great, but we were still getting stuck in the mud. One of the most unique elements of the entire feature was this stump with a rock in its roots. We had to showcase it at the very top of the waterfalls. I should also mention that all the contractors caught wind of my moss obsession, and before I knew it, everyone was collecting it from around my yard. I just kept finding different buckets full of it. Working well into the night, we continued adding moss and gravel. Pro tip, getting into your work is crucial for success. Although we couldn't appreciate the fruits of our labor yet, ending the night with a light show was well earned. It's fair to say that we were all exhausted by now, but there was still more work to be done and only a few hours to complete the task at hand before everyone had to leave. The final section of the oak made its way to the bog, the plumbing was buttoned up, and I even pulled out the remainder of the aquatic plants from the old DIY pond, where I found a friend.
And we got a little friend in here, this frog, so we have a better home for him.
We finalized the edge work, topped the bog with some small gravel, completed the work in the waterfall, and finally let it rip. The bog holds so much water that it took nearly 10 minutes to work its way through. We just added a few small rocks and chipped off the edge of a stone to dial in its appearance. Till then, we had been laboring through less than ideal conditions, and everyone was tired. Seeing this was the morale boost that everyone needed to cross the finish line. It was funny that one of the last rocks we added was that giant from earlier. It and the accent boulders brought everything full circle. Then everyone took a final look at the waterfall, we said our goodbyes, and the team dispersed. The rain finally stopped afterward, which meant I could landscape in peace. I had a few sentimental plants from the old house, including this pine. It was the resting place for my late American bullfrog of 14 years, MJ. I couldn't leave this at the old house, and I even found his remains during the move, which I could finally return to their rightful spot under this tree. When I placed the statue, I realized a new friend had arrived. Frogs are very special to me. They're my favorite animals, and likely why I developed such a connection to wildlife. With MJ as part of the feature, and the new frogs who came of their own accord, this was a serendipitous moment. The water cleared up significantly in the following week. The pond may have been up and running, but it was a blank slate. There was much more I'd have to address later, like cord management, finishing the flagstone patio, adding an upper seating area, and much more. Simply put, only the initial phase of the project was complete because of all the setbacks the rain caused. Things were extremely muddy, both inside and outside of the pond. I mean a lot of mud. It rained so much that this mound of dirt couldn't be removed until it all dried up. Once it did a few weeks later, the boys from Aquatic Edge returned to even that out, framing the left side with more stones, rough in a seating area, and the flagstone path. From here, I'd have to address everything on my own. Anyway, this swim pond holds roughly 8,000 gallons of water and is over 5 feet deep. The water is pulled into what we refer to as an intake bay. Here, the skimmer removes floating debris and water is pulled through the bed of rocks. That water is then pumped up to the wetlands bog filter. Bacteria colonies living in the rocks and robust plant growth will naturally process the water. I only had a few items then, but eventually it would be filled with plants. After being processed in the bog, the water cascades through the falls and into the pond, creating a loop. My vision for this project was to mimic the types of waterfalls and creeks I saw while growing up in western Pennsylvania, characterized by pooling areas and wide blade waterfalls. This feature captured that aesthetic well and was made possible with materials sourced from PA and my yard. Yes, I really did just go and make an 8,000 gallon pond for feeder goldfish. I purchased most of them for only cents a piece from one of those wretched feeder fish tanks, while I sought out the Shubunkins separately. Most of them are quite old, but one that's very special to me is Petey. When I built that old pond, it held water hyacinth. I put some of those in an aquarium, and they must have harbored eggs because baby fish emerged. We raised them indoors for a year, but only Petey survived. It was a joy having Petey indoors for a year, but I knew he belonged outside with the other fish. He's grown significantly since, and here he is 3 years later. But that's not all. I also adopted a different group from a home that no longer wanted them. I put some in a pond I built for my mom and kept the rest for myself. Anyway, I netted up both groups and temperature acclimated them. Then came the release. I can't explain how satisfying it was to watch them slowly enter what may be one of the most elaborate goldfish ponds ever. They swam around, clearly enjoying their new home. Although this continued for a few weeks, winter was on the horizon, so it wouldn't last for long. The time came for them to retreat to the bottom, where they would rest for the foreseeable future. Months later, the pond lay dormant, literally frozen in time. Leaves are suspended in the ice, as was much of the pond itself. However, looks can be deceiving because the water was still running. One of the questions I get most about having a pond is, what do you do with it in the winter? The answer is simple. If it's set up correctly, nothing. The basin for this pond is about 5.5 feet deep, which is well below the frost line. So although the top is frozen, the bottom is not. And just to be clear, you don't need to go even nearly that deep to pull it off. Usually it's about 18 inches or more. Meanwhile, the waterfalls continue as usual beneath a thin layer of ice. The flow ensures the environment remains highly oxygenated for the fish as they patiently await warmer days. Although not inhabited by fish and kind of unrelated, the same was true for my fountain. I had to show this because I thought it looked incredible. The display at night was pretty intriguing too. Portals emerged from under several inches of ice as snow fell from the skies above. These ephemeral sculptures and landscapes wouldn't last forever though. Slowly but surely the days got warmer and more hospitable for life. As spring descended upon the land, a very distinct call began sounding each and every morning. It belonged to the eastern phoebe who had returned to their nesting grounds. I made sure to leave their nest from last year because they often reuse them. However, the new vantage point over the pond was more preferable because they were busy building a new one out of mud and moss. Now that's my kind of bird. They specialize in eating flying insects and prefer to nest near man-made structures and bodies of water. So in building the pond, I unintentionally created a more optimal home for them. While the pair built, spring rains brought sustenance to life that had been seeded months prior, flowers bloomed, and all of this beckoned more wildlife to return. This green frog was eager to bask, collecting warmth after months under ice. All the while, the deer sought refuge under nearby trees in the brush. The fish overwintered well too. They were becoming more active at the water's surface and begging for food. I couldn't feed them yet though. The temperatures weren't consistently warm yet, and during the colder seasons, goldfish can't digest food. Algae in ponds is inevitable, and new ponds often get a lot of it. String algae had formed everywhere, especially in the waterfalls. It's fairly easy to remove, but why did it happen in the first place? The most significant variable at play is usually excess nutrients introduced during the construction process. In this case, all that mud. As you can see here, the algae is even harboring a lot of it.
Unfortunately, whenever we built this, a lot of dirt was introduced, and I also haven't had a chance to reseed this hillside and finish it all up, so every time it rains, mud just gets sent right into the pond, so a lot of excess nutrients plus the sun equals algae.
That's also why the water is so cloudy. It had been fairly clear at the beginning of the season, but non-stop rains were continually sending muddy water straight into the pond. All of this meant that some spring cleaning was required. I shut off the pumps to better access the algae with a pressure washer. I don't know about you, but seeing it fall away like this is just so satisfying. It takes a while for the water to make its way back up to the wetlands, but once it does, the flow washes the debris downstream effortlessly. I then used a net to get what I could at the bottom of the falls, while the remainder had to be skimmed from the basin. All of this concluded in a slight water change, and thus you have my spring maintenance. This work, combined with rain and warmer weather, must have set the mood because everything changed that very evening. As the skies darkened over the waters and surrounding landscape, a new sound filled the airwaves. It was very loud, and something I was all too familiar with. Wetlands all across eastern North America harbor the little creatures making this tune. That would be none other than the spring peepers. Unlike many of the other species that prefer the warmer days to come, peepers are mostly active during the cooler transition in early spring. These chorus frogs can stick and climb to things, so you often find them in reeds and other plants in proximity to bodies of water. This was just the first wave of them, so only a few males were present on this evening. Although I removed some algae the day before, this wasn't a proper solution. If I had any hope of dialing things in, I'd have to do something about the runoff, especially on the right side. For now, I plan to simply add some grass to bind the soil. After manually raking the rocks and breaking up the top, I spread the seed. Long term, I intend to do something different, but I needed an immediate solution at that time. Just as I finished blanketing the seed, the peepers re-emerged and began singing their song once more. Only this time, it sounded like there were a few more in the chorus. Now when I say these are small, it's not an exaggeration. Here's a full-grown male which is right around 1 inch long. It's truly astounding that their sound can be heard from up to 2 miles away. Meanwhile, things in the water feature were really shaking up. I noticed a completely different species which is very special to me, American toads. Truth be told, they're probably the single species that truly sparked my interest in animals. They were everywhere and making good use of the entire water feature, some in the waterfalls, a few in the basin, and elsewhere. Much like the peepers, the males typically arrive first as they call out to attract potential mates. This symphony continued well into the evening and would for many more. In the following days, I saw the phoebes spending more time at the nest, but they weren't building. Instead, they were taking turns incubating a clutch of eggs. Although valiant, their efforts were being challenged. In the nest were 4 pristine eggs. 3 looked clean, but the other was covered in dirt, right? Not so. Both parents work in unison, incubating the eggs in shifts. Idle time between gave a parasite free access to tamper with their nest. This egg actually belongs to a completely different species of bird, the brown-headed cowbird. These are considered brood parasites. Rather than build their own nests, they instead lay in others. The host birds then raise the cowbirds as their own if they don't recognize the eggs as foreign objects. However, cowbirds usually hatch and develop faster, outcompeting the initial brood. For now, there was no telling what would happen here, but I did notice something else when reviewing the time-lapse footage. Did you catch that? It happened quickly, but if we slow things down, you'll see exactly what occurred. That's the female cowbird, and it returned to the nest to give her baby an upper hand via less competition. Shortly after this robbery, Mom returned, completely unaware of what just occurred. I was absolutely shocked to see this, but something just below their nest caught my eye as well, a ringneck snake. These tiny snakes spend most of their time underground, so this was a pleasant surprise. It was likely under nearby leaf litter and wanted to bask. However, I was doing work in the area and didn't want to harm it, so I moved it to a safer location nearby. Spring rains continued rolling through the lands. As the thunder subsided, the sounds of frogs permeated the airwaves once more, and I swear the volume was turned up. I suppose with a few days under their belt, the peepers were at full strength. Even so, there didn't appear to be any mates. The toads were calling out as well, and the competition was fierce. There are generally way more males than females, and they must be persistent. Any movement in the water could be a potential mate, so they're quick to latch on. Even if that's on each other, but a quick squeak lets them know to back off. However, all their hard work paid off because a female was in their midst. She was unimpressed with the ones near her though, and escaped their radar underwater. As soon as she surfaced, and before I could catch it, a link-up, or what's known as amplexus, occurred. I was hopeful this pair would be successful. Rains continued the following day. This was the perfect backdrop for the toads to continue doing their thing. The pair from before still hadn't reproduced. Amplexes can last for a while, and perhaps the location wasn't ideal. Luckily, the males are smaller, so it was easy for her to cart him around in search of the ideal location. The weather picked up, continuing for the entire day. These rains, which ushered in the frogs to begin with, caused things to cool off in the days to follow, and thus the symphony subsided. Only a single toad remained, eagerly waiting to start again. You'll see that my efforts to minimize mud runoff were beginning to work, too. Despite days of rain, the water was fairly clear. My fish remembered this means food, but it was still too cold to feed them. I was also curious whether the toads from the other day were successful. They must have been, because a huge cluster of eggs was wrapped around the plants where I last saw them. That wasn't all. I found a second cluster.
So I am ecstatic right now because the toads were successful. Right down here in the intake bay are, I guess, thousands of toad eggs all wrapped around these plants here. So these ones should be good. Their only concern really is the fish, but I don't really think that they'll bother with them, so I'll leave those ones be. However, there was also a bunch of them up here in the wetlands filter, right in a quiet corner. My concern with this area though is that as the tadpoles make their way out of there, they could potentially wind up all the way over here into the waterfalls and who knows where. So I think what I would like to do, just to ensure their success is as high as possible, is to make a little dam around here just to kind of keep them secluded to this little area.
So that's exactly what I did. I created a little dam around the eggs to give them a better chance. It wasn't pretty, but I knew it's something I'd have to get used to. It would take time for them to hatch out of their eggs and develop into toadlets. Meanwhile, a completely different species took up residence down in the basin, water striders. These little predators effortlessly glide across the water's surface, searching for prey. I've always found them to be extremely captivating and graceful. As I watched them skate back and forth, I heard something new. It happened a few times, and just as I discovered where it came from, it stopped. Up in the weeping cherry tree was a new frog in town, a gray tree frog. Its gray coloration camouflaged it perfectly on the bark. My presence must have made it bashful because it refused to call again, holding this position until I went in for the evening. I had done very little around the pond till then. It drove me nuts, but I still wasn't ready for much. My plan was to make usable recreation areas within designated pockets of plants and other features for the animals. That would take time to create, but I collected a few plants to begin moving in the right direction. However, this entire area was excavated beyond being usable for its intended purpose. I had to raise everything by about a foot to fix that. I couldn't do it all at once because I worked by hand. In the meantime, I collected soil from around the areas with too much that I used to elevate the upper portion of the seating area. This platform was designated for a swinging bench. I measured and excavated for that before setting the posts. A few weeks prior, I also seeded the lawn with dandelions. It was coming together, but as I said, my long-term plan with this would be much different. All the while, the deer passed through, and one of the Phoebe watched from the fence. I heard that tree frog again, and found him in the most unexpected place, behind the old ledger board. This foreshadowed what was the most lively evening in the pond's existence so far. The night began as many others before, with toads and peepers calling for mates. However, something was off. There were at least 50 male toads scattered around, which was significantly more than previous nights. Then I saw her. This little lady was lured in, quickly making her way to the breeding grounds. She dove deep into the water, and the boys sensed her movement, but they just missed her. While attempting to track her down, I noticed something bizarre. A toad was latched onto a green frog with another nearby. I was so distracted by this that I completely missed a pair connecting. The peeper's efforts seemed to pay off as well. A female was on the search for the best match. That said, I never saw them in amplexes. There appeared to be more peepers than previous nights as well, scattered in the grass. There was a green frog in their midst, which I imagine was hunting them down, but I can't confirm with certainty. The gray tree frog called out again after making its way to this rock. When I went to get a closer look, I discovered someone I was not expecting to see, an American bullfrog. It was quite young and likely migrated here sometime earlier because this was the first I ever saw it. I couldn't help but think of MJ because that's exactly what he looked like when he was young. Anyway, it was awesome to get a better look at the tree frog. Its camouflage was impeccable. It looked just like a piece of lichen on the rock. There were well over 80 frogs in or around the waters on this evening alone. In a way, it was kind of a full circle moment because this was the final night of the toad's breeding season. The pairs just had to finish reproducing the following day. The process takes so long because the females lay thousands of eggs that the male fertilizes, with as many as 20,000. This was the last of 9 confirmed clutches, which means there were upwards of 180,000 eggs within the pond. The survival rate of frogs and toads that make it to adulthood to breed is estimated only to be around 1%. That's not very many, even with a good starting point. This all happened over a few weeks, so despite these ones being less than a day old, the others were already emerging as free-swimming tadpoles. Their long and challenging journey into toadhood was only just beginning. They weren't the only hatchlings, though. While all of that unfolded, the Phoebe were feverishly watching over their nest. You'll see that they slowly rotate the eggs around the nest during incubation to ensure the embryos properly develop. As expected, the cowbird was the first to emerge from the confines of its egg. The Phoebe raised the bird as their own, unaware of what they were doing. Their babies started hatching a few days later, but by the time they did, the cowbird was already well grown. These developed alongside it for the majority of its time in the nest, but the size discrepancy took a toll. Eventually they were smothered out, and the same would happen to the third when it finally hatched. As the only remaining nestling with no competition, the cowbird grew even faster. When it gained enough strength to stand and observe its surroundings, instincts kicked in, and it flew away, leaving the Phoebe with nothing but an empty nest. Nature may appear brutal, but life often develops unexpectedly, and things are not always as they seem. Cowbirds often target eastern Phoebe nests, and they must know it. Although they may appear helpless, these monogamous birds in fact have a built-in failsafe for scenarios just like this, the ability to produce 2 broods each season. I was hopeful for their potential redemption, but only time would tell if they'd lay again. For now, they were enjoying the tail end of the spring rains. They weren't the only ones either. The deer often passed through during these rains, grazing on foliage at the woodbine. These rains were persistent and strong, continuing for many days. The grass and plants in the surrounding areas really appreciated this. All the water gave them the strength to continue developing, which further helped with the previous runoff issues. The lone gray tree frog from before seemed to like the rain as he hid within this lily. Only now, he was no longer alone. There was competition. The banter ended shortly after this, though. It wasn't until the following day that something genuinely amazing occurred. Seemingly out of nowhere, gray tree frogs were everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Unlike the others before them, these frogs had the freedom to climb and stick to whatever surfaces they wanted. Many were on rocks, a few near the water, and others on the driftwood. There were even 2 pairs already in amplexus. It was surprising to see how much more balanced the male to female ratio was compared to the previous species. That said, such a meetup only occurred on this night, so perhaps they showed up all at once rather than over a period of time. Again, I just want to take a moment to appreciate how remarkable their camouflage is. It looked so much like lichen that I just couldn't get over it. As the males called out, the females were carefully assessing their options. This one specifically was very particular. Initially, she was lured in by this one near the intake bay. After some thought, she determined he wasn't right and returned to the waters. She then climbed up this rock and stared at this one for a while. It looked promising, but she rejected him too. The one on the rock behind caught her attention, but not for long. The previous male ended up being right after all, and she accepted his embrace. This all continued well into the evening. It was very special to me. I had only seen these frogs a handful of times in my life prior to this spring. Yet here I was, only feet from my house, surrounded by a cacophony of froggy trills. It was music to my ears. This evening, and the many before it, serve as a testament to how remarkable frogs are. Their fine-tuned senses allow them to locate water, sometimes traveling miles to get there. What a way to end the season of frogs. I never saw eggs the following day, and unfortunately there wasn't much foliage in the pond at this time. I believe they may have been eaten by the fish, but I can't say for sure. Either way, I'll ensure they have more appropriate arrangements next year. Now that the migratory frogs are done with the pond, the resident green frogs appeared at ease within this newfound silence. I was finally able to work in peace now, too. I didn't have to worry about potentially harming anything because the green frogs stuck to the waters. Anyway, this platform required some drainage. A simple French drain was sufficient to ensure excess water wouldn't sit around and make the dirt all soupy. Above this, I added a layer of geotextile to mitigate erosion. Layering rocks above this would further help with that. The look was solidified with pavers and mulch.
It's awesome finally starting to see some of the dirt disappear. This thing has just been a mud pit for, I don't know, however long now. Tired of seeing it, so to see some of the landscape filling together is awesome. A little bit of work to do there still, but this whole area here, I gotta raise it up like I did that. And it's a hot day, so gotta get to work.
Hauling countless wheelbarrows full of dirt through this heat was a challenge, but necessary because I had to raise the platform. I packed it down and added fabric around the edges before sending the French drain through this area and finishing it off with a top covering. Funny enough, the Phoebe appreciated the adjustments I made to the landscape. The top of the swinging bench became one of their favorite perches while they tracked insects. It and the weeping cherry gave a perfect line of sight to their nest, where they were roosting at once more. In the weeks since being bested by the cowbirds, they carefully spruced things up and gave things a second try. While these eggs were being laid, new life emerged from old ones. In the days and weeks leading up to this, the remainder of the tadpoles were developing in their eggs. As they hatched, they were quite small and not adept at swimming. Meanwhile, the others from before were much larger. Every square inch of the pond was inevitably swarmed with tadpoles, a remarkable sight indeed. However, it created an issue. They liked resting within the algae, which was forming again. I wanted to remove it, but not at their detriment, so I decided to wait for their metamorphosis into toads to complete first. Also, the dam in the wetlands intended to preserve their location failed. Despite my initial concerns, they managed to end up in the other polling areas without being harmed. Their presence was also very apparent at night. It was one thing to know that thousands of tadpoles inhabit these waters, but it was another to see it. They would typically feed on algae or swim around the fish. Together against the backdrop of the nightlight, they created an otherworldly display. Meanwhile, the green frogs looked over it all, happy to have reclaimed their pond. Since I couldn't address the algae yet, I was only able to add the annual plants. Impatiens and papyrus to be specific. I thoroughly removed the soil and everything from their roots before peppering them throughout the landscape, which added nice pops of color. The fish are always curious about anything I'm doing. This was no exception. You'll see that the iris and other flowers were blooming too. Although these plants would help with filtration, it would take many more to make a difference. Part of why I raised the ground was to create another seating area. This one consisted of a configuration of posts that I set in the ground. I continued the fabric and gravel around them before topping it all with pea pebbles. Hauling material up the slope to the seating area made everything a challenge. It might have been fine if it had just been a few trips, but I had to do this hundreds of times to raise the dirt and achieve the desired effect. I didn't only want seats here though. I found a few stumps on the property that would allow me to integrate more plants. I broke up as much dirt on them as possible with a pick and pressure washed the remainder. I knew I wanted a stump to go here. It was just a matter of getting the right configuration. It started getting dark, so I took the opportunity to line up all the posts with the laser level. While doing all of that, I kept hearing faint little chirps, which could only mean one thing. The Phoebe eggs were hatching. She managed to lay 5 healthy eggs, which thankfully went undisturbed. They were carefully incubated until the babies entered the world, calling out for their parents. They flew around the pond and surrounding area non-stop for weeks, gathering insects for the brood. They'd track prey from a perch, collect it, and land on a different one to inspect the surroundings. Once the coast was clear, they'd fly to the nest, feed the babies, and repeat. This commotion continued for hours daily as they grew, which happened quickly because of all this hard work. Only days earlier, they hardly had the strength to move. Now they were extremely alert, and becoming ever aware of the world that waited beyond the confines of the nest. What once cradled them was now struggling to contain these energetic nestlings. It was in luck, because the curiosity of what lay beyond could no longer be avoided. A brave one made its way onto the downspout with another just behind, and in an instant, the second one dropped to the ground. Petrified by what just occurred, the first refused to jump and hunkered down near the nest while the others scanned the horizon for their parents. Eventually, it navigated back into the nest where the 4 remained until the next day. Once eager to feed their young, the Phoebe now called from the roof and a tree near the wood line, attempting to lure the fledglings from the nest. They were unsure, but as the day went on with minimal interaction from their parents, they got restless. Eventually, this one gained the courage to leave the nest, where it attempted to gain attention from the downspout. It couldn't help but test its wings before gliding to the ground. It was unsure of the surrounding area, but not for long. Two of its siblings dropped down right after. With the three of them on the ground, their parents chirped nonstop as a distraction and to lure the fledglings into the woods. I assumed they were on high alert for my presence, but then I realized a new danger was present: a hawk. They occasionally fly over to scope the scene and must have kept tabs on this nest. I was relieved it didn't appreciate my presence though, because after circling for a few minutes, it soared off into the distance. With the looming danger out of sight, the parents calmed down. Shortly after, the babies dispersed. One flew into the grass where it sat for a while, nervous to continue its journey. This little one mustered up the strength to fly, but only briefly. It clung to the house, unsure of its next step. Mom stopped by a few times for encouragement. Once it knew what to do, it flew into the woods with its parents and the one from the grass following behind. The other was much slower and didn't appear to have the flying prowess of its siblings. It hopped along the house, calling for its parents between each step. All the while, the fifth and final bird remained in the nest. It hatched many days after the others and wasn't ready to go just yet. The landscape was always intended to be a crucial component of this pond, but it was still far from complete. I was finally making steps toward that ultimate goal though. I cut the anchored posts in the seating area, which were the footers for the benches that would sit around this fire pit. These are of minor importance though. It's the area behind the benches where I really had to put focus. Luckily, I had just enough bricks left over from the retaining wall inside the pond to create another one here. This would frame everything in, help with erosion, and allow for additional features by reducing the grade of the hillside. I did the same in other locations with a few large boulders and a segment of that oak tree. Then I regraded everything before adding geotextile. The purpose of this area and what it would soon become is a pollinator garden of sorts. With the stage set, I just needed a lot of plants. Most are natives, with a few select non-natives and items directly from my yard. The process of adding them all took several days. Typically I'd plant much denser than this, but I left room for these to grow and for others I couldn't get now. Either way, it was already starting to work because butterflies were flocking to the milkweed. I noticed there were many more green frogs now too, all inhabiting different niches throughout the pond. This large male was attempting to court a female or fighting over territory. I'm unsure which. In either case, it persistently followed the other around the outskirts of where it resides. A development occurred with the deer as well, because now they had fawns. There were 2 moms, each with 2 babies. It's funny because the adults just wanted to graze in peace, and although the babies would nibble on things here or there, they appeared to be more interested in playing with their friends. That was until Mom told them it was time to continue traveling. The Phoebe were doing something similar with this one as well. They fed it for 5 additional days before deciding on this wet and rainy afternoon it had enough. Like its siblings, they stopped coming to the nest to encourage its exit. Eventually it got the hint and left the nest, landing at the top of the pond. Soaked and visibly unsure of its surroundings, it decided the best thing to do was take its first bath. It slowly made its way to the woods as instructed by its parents. Inching closer to safety, Mom couldn't help but sing her song as if to say my job is complete. While this young one sat and observed the unfamiliar landscape, the Phoebe sounded a few more times before swooping down to say goodbye. They both disappeared in the woods, where they would remain for the rest of the season until migrating south for the winter and returning to the pond next spring to breed. In their absence, the flying insects were free to do their thing again, especially the pollinators. After adding some of the plants to their garden, I came up with another idea. That began by undoing some of the work from before. I pulled back the liner to access the soil, moved the plants, and excavated a square-shaped hole. Then I tamped the base to remove inconsistencies. However, I had to check its level to understand how to proceed. Adding sand to the low spots made it easy to level out a foundation for pavers. I aligned these and filled a gap around the edges with gravel. Just like the pond, I put geotextile over this to protect the liner. Luckily, I had a lot left over from the pond, I just had to cut it to fit. I did my best to conform this to the sides of the hole before adding more geotextile and a series of milk crates. These would elevate hardscape material above a water reservoir to create a fountain. It was a nearly perfect fit, with the back being taller than the front. That said, I peeled back the liners to backfill the soil, making things very stable. There's a creek in the front of my property where I went to collect some things. I've had this driftwood on the side for safekeeping for a while now. I knew it would be perfect for this. I needed a few stones as well. With these items, I could turn this odd structure into something incredible. I began by covering the crates with fabric to retain smaller elements. I rolled the largest stone on top, using it as the starting point. The driftwood fit perfectly around this, followed by a few smaller rocks. This wouldn't require a lot of flow, so this little pump was perfect. I cut a hole in a crate to gain access. To produce the desired effect, I added a liner under the top stone so it draped over. I then filled the gaps with expanding foam, which I hid with moss. After filling a void with small stones, it was ready for water and thus a test run. This was all close to what I envisioned, it just required more details. I added foam, pea pebbles, and moss to finalize the feature's interior. Then I removed the excess liner along the edges and backfilled to create a seamless integration with the surrounding landscape. This stump also helped with that. I adjusted some existing plants to better match the layout before adding more natives to the surrounding areas. The purpose of this fountain was to create a drinking area for insects, with things like butterflies in mind. The pond doesn't really include those features because the falls are quite turbulent. My instinct is usually to include as much flow as possible, but I had to dial it back for this one. The goal is to dampen stones and mosses to create safe resting areas. I knew that having this near the garden would be beneficial too. That and the surrounding area was far from complete, but these new details further evolved the dynamic of everything from an aesthetic and functional perspective. In no time, butterflies and bees were enjoying the flowers. As neat as that was, an elaborate microcosm was at play just below the surface, which could be easily overlooked. Invertebrates of all kinds inhabited nearly every square inch of space. Spiders wove webs to ensnare their victims, while millipedes marched up mountainous terrain. It was incredible, and on a fundamental level, invertebrates are the backbone and foundation of any healthy ecosystem. In fact, 97% of animal life is comprised of such beings. Without them, nothing works as it should. The frogs wouldn't have anything to eat, the birds wouldn't be able to rear their young, and so much more. That's why I put so much thought into developing features like the pollinator garden. I love the appearance of beautiful flowers, and the bright colors help draw in the pollinating insects, who meticulously search for nectar or pollen in each flower. As a result, this became an extremely active area at the pond because butterflies, moths, bees, and other creatures worked non-stop. There were even hummingbird moths, which are an oddity. They look just like hummingbirds, but are in reality moths. The milkweed even attracted the most famous butterflies of all, monarchs. It was late in the season, so I believe they were simply passing through to gain sustenance as they migrated south, with their offspring's offspring returning to this very plant the following year. Another creature used this plant as a place of refuge, milkweed aphids. Swamp milkweed like this is one of their favorite places to congregate and feed. They're toxic to most other creatures, but one of their few predators was aware of their presence, and aphids are one of their favorite foods. This ladybug was hot on their trail. It hunted them down and began feasting. Milkweed bugs also fed on the plants if they weren't breeding. There were even bizarre-looking creatures emerging from the waters to complete their transformation into something beautiful, damselflies and dragonflies. These gorgeous little jewels of the pond flew back and forth in search of prey, occasionally resting on marginal plants. Some were even curious about the tripod. Like everything, some thrived and others did not. Luckily, the ants were ready to recycle their remains. These micro-titans of the animal world are key to the health of many ecosystems. Here, colonies are peppered throughout the landscape around the pond. Feverishly marching back and forth, they gathered food for their growing numbers in lands unseen. Their presence caused an unfortunate issue: aphids on the water lilies. Ants often farm them in exchange for their excrement, a sweet nectar known as honeydew. This made the lilies appear worse for wear, which I didn't appreciate. The days were long and hot with much activity, but the evenings were just as eventful. Different creatures like spiders, predatory beetles, and moths emerged. Meanwhile, the fish and tadpoles blissfully swam throughout the backlit waters, unaware of their surroundings. A few raccoon occasionally scavenged the rocks for fish food I may have dropped. In the skies above, bats quickly darted around, allowing for just a fleeting view. However, the real action was occurring in the surrounding areas. Thousands of little lights blinked on and off from the ends of bioluminescent insects, fireflies. They were in search of one another, hoping to mate. Something equally astounding began occurring at the pond, which I noticed one day while cleaning the basin.
I went and cleaned out the skimmer here just a little bit ago, and as I was walking over, I thought I saw a bunch of crickets jumping around until I realized what was actually going on.
The thousands of tadpoles that called these waters home for many weeks were completing their metamorphosis into toads. Some still had tails, while others took their first steps on solid ground. These toadlets, which were hardly the size of a fingernail, were everywhere. They hid within moss, plants, and rocks, one of their preferred hunting grounds. Any micro critters were on the menu. The area near the top of the waterfalls was especially teeming with them. Their parents were wise to produce so many eggs, which resulted in thousands of toads. The journey into toadhood wouldn't be without peril because they too were on the menu. Being this tiny made them extremely vulnerable to any predators in the area. The grounds were full of spiders, much larger than them. The ringneck snake from months prior also returned and likely to eat toads. A garter snake was on the prowl too. As adorable as these little toads are, there would likely be an imbalance without predation. Checks and balances naturally occur as one species takes advantage of another. While small, the toadlets would remain close to the pond. They'd slowly move away from the water and toward the woods as they grew throughout the rest of the season. However, they weren't the only animals growing. That random bullfrog from spring decided to make this pond home and was getting big. Funny enough, almost immediately after the toads left the waters of the pond, newcomers emerged. The goldfish must have been doing their thing in the spring because baby fish were everywhere. This was exciting to see and surely will happen year after year. That's no problem for now because such a pond could easily accommodate more fish. With the tadpoles gone, I could finally remove the algae too. Getting it out of the way is always so satisfying, especially in this area. Handful after handful, the wetlands were freed from its grasp. I also took the time to thin out and trim much of the mint. All the while, a young frog observed from a nearby rock. I also noticed some commotion at a recently planted tree where a little song sparrow watched over a brood of eggs. In no time they hatched and were completely reliant on their parents. Luckily, they collected food non-stop as the nestlings grew. However, it all happened so quickly that I completely missed their departure. This all made room for plants that I got months before. They had been sitting in this tub for so long that many were growing out of the sides of their pots. Anyway, I planted these throughout the wetlands. As they grow and develop, they'll bolster the filtration capacity of the pond by pulling excess nutrients from the water column, which means less algae. The added foliage would create more habitat for various animals too. All of that helped bring balance, but not for long. Things were about to slow down and go to rest for the foreseeable future. The vast majority of that occurred during the spring and summer months. Now leaves are falling from the trees, temperatures are dropping, days have become shorter, and many creatures who frequented the waters seem to have moved on until warmer days return. However, pond season wasn't over yet. Despite how things may have appeared, life was still in full effect, and more secrets were about to reveal themselves. These ponds don't require much maintenance, but I find it most important to do it in the spring as you already saw, and now the fall. I wanted to do as much as possible before it got too cold. Little did I know what I'd soon discover when I got to work. The algae I was battling returned yet again, and it had to go. As I explained, this will eventually stop being an issue when the environment gains equilibrium, which usually takes about 3 years. Until then, I have to see it or remove it, and I don't find it particularly appealing, so I'll take the latter. All of the plants I've been adding will be critical to the algae's natural decline by removing nutrients it feeds on. Maximum plant growth is the goal, but that mint was going wild again. Keeping it in check is essential because as you can see it gets way out of hand, and in fact I'll likely remove it altogether when the other plants fully integrate. I was going through the motions netting algae without a second thought until I saw movement on the rock. Thankfully there was some water to sustain an unexpected tadpole. I returned it as quickly as I could and sifted through the rest. I didn't see any others in what I removed, but many were in the pond, which had me perplexed. Why was I seeing them this late in the season? I thought to myself, 4 unique species of frogs including American toads, spring peepers, gray tree frogs, and green frogs were trying to breed at the pond. All would have laid their eggs months ago, and froglets had already left the waters to grow up. I failed to document the green frogs, but they were growing well. I also occasionally find pristine young toads in the outskirts that inspire me and make me hopeful for their future. Maybe one day they'll return to the waters where they were born to have children of their own. These were too large to belong to anyone but the green frogs, or so I thought until I realized something. I just kept seeing that random bullfrog. At any given time, it and several other frogs were visible, with silly antics often ensuing. For a while I thought this was the only bullfrog, but as some of the others grew, I realized there was quite a few of them. The green frogs did their thing, but I never heard the bullfrogs calling or saw breeding. However, tadpoles from both species take years to complete their metamorphosis and look similar, so finding them this late in the year makes sense. I won't say definitively, but based on their characteristics, I think these are most likely bullfrog tadpoles. Either way, this brings up the audience concerns about them being here. I'm honestly fine for them to live here, even if they'll eat a few things, because they're another native species.
Of course, I'd prefer if they didn't eat the smaller frogs or my fish, but that's probably inevitable.
The baby fish from months earlier have grown significantly, and they weren't alone. I realized there was a completely new round of them when I was trimming the plants in the basin, but they were so small I couldn't even get footage of them. If they keep reproducing this much, I suppose bullfrogs getting a fish or two might not be a bad thing. I even had the opportunity to adopt 2 fish from my cousin, Tilly and Jimmy.
Many question my decision to keep goldfish because they're not native and often invasive.
Believe me, I understand the logic, but this pond was made for them and otherwise wouldn't exist. Also, their invasiveness is mainly from irresponsible people releasing them into places they don't belong, which I won't do. There's also the thought that they'll eat everything in the pond, including tadpoles, but if I had native fish, that wouldn't happen. In reality, this will occur anywhere with fish, native or not, that aren't small. Of course, the frogs know this, which is why they reproduce by the thousands. And as you've seen, despite many fish and the pond not being as densely planted as it will eventually be, countless tadpoles still completed their metamorphosis. That said, their odds will increase exponentially next year and in the ones to follow as the plants develop, and when I add other water features in the surrounding landscape that won't house large fish.
One of those features is going to go off the left of this seating area here and pretty much fill up most of the space going through the rocks and down in here. And the crazy thing is that the way I'm going to set this up, it's going to be perfect for the animals that decided to take up residence under these rocks.
I piled the stones here simply to tidy the yard. What ended up happening though is that I unintentionally created a place of refuge for red-backed salamanders. I was shocked to find them in the middle of the yard like this because I think of salamanders living in shaded areas. I wanted to build that earlier this year but didn't have the time. I'm glad that happened because now that I know they want to live here, I can build it more in line with their needs.
You know, it's always when I overturn a rock, look behind a leaf, or simply take a closer look that I find inspiration. Something that's always done that for me and played a huge role in this pond's development is moss.
It has a way of naturalizing these spaces unlike anything else. It's created countless microhabitats around the pond that can only be described as magical. Each is unique in its own way, including the animals that use them. They often harbor little plants that take time to form, like these ferns. Some are more developed, which makes me curious how will all appear when the others do the same. The big picture matters, but I don't think it would look as significant without all these small details. It's kind of like how a home without decorations appears liminal.
Even with all of these elements taking shape, it's very evident to me when viewing this all from the new vantage point of the deck that a lot of crucial components are still missing. It too is incomplete, but even now it greatly improves the view of everything and serves as an awesome platform to begin our journey into the Oasis.
Stepping down to the water's edge on this rock reveals one of my favorite views. You can truly appreciate the beauty of the fish and waterfalls from here. Moving toward the left should draw you into other features. However, much of this is in shambles, like the flagstone path and hillside, both of which I'll address next year. Things change as you scale the rocky stairs. This platform provides a unique view, with the pond on one side, the future salamander habitat on the other, the pollinator garden behind, and select plantings in the front. The culmination of these elements is intended to create a place of relaxation. There's also the swinging bench, which I designed to fit perfectly at the top of the falls. It's one of my favorite views because you can appreciate the pooling areas and the habitats created within them. You can easily step down to the rocks and to the other side from here, which for now is just grass. A unique feature will eventually transform this space and connect the deck below with something completely different in the yard above. The end goal is for everything to be interconnected. There will be almost no grass, countless features for the animals to utilize, and areas where we can enjoy their presence. Most recently, the squirrels have diligently collected nuts for the colder months, using my air conditioner as their processing headquarters. The deer have also passed through like usual, which is always a joy. This journey has had its fair share of criticism. There's always someone to disagree with every choice you've made, and that's fine. We all have different perspectives.
I don't feel the need to explain myself on much, but there was one decision that I made which transpired up here that I had no idea would be so divisive.
Many thought I should have removed the parasitic cowbird egg from the eastern phoebe nest. I would like to start by saying that nature is brutal. It doesn't really care how we feel about it. Unfortunately, this is just what cowbirds do. They don't build their own nests and won't raise their own young. It just doesn't happen. Plus, it's illegal to tamper with their eggs, and to make matters worse, they're spiteful. When a host bird or someone who thinks they're being helpful removes their eggs, the cowbird often returns to destroy all of them. All that's to say, intervention isn't wise.
I wasn't even going to formally address this, but now you know.
From start to finish, this was one of the most exhausting experiences of my life. Yet the result is a place that embodies tranquility. I like that juxtaposition, and for now, this is home. It's fascinating how a few changes to a standard yard made all the difference in who decided to move in. There's even more I have to build, so this is only the end of the first chapter. Who knows what awaits on the next page? I never imagined I'd one day be blessed to have the oasis of my dreams only feet from my house. I'm grateful for the efforts of my friends from Aquascape to help set this all in motion. A look back at this picture always puts a smile on my face. Many of my fondest childhood memories were formed in nature. Although this may be man-made, I think I'll look back on these memories with fondness as well. The awe of being surrounded by hundreds of frogs made me feel like that again almost 30 years later. It reminded me that life is always happening around us. Sometimes you just have to unplug and take a closer look.
That said, I'm left with one question. What else happened that I completely missed?